Now we have to be clear. It's the ruling class that is culpable for this situation. Right. And what is their response? Now, in order for us to build an effective struggle to fight against the current onslaught against working people and the oppressed, we must be clear about what is the source of the problem. Right. In a city like Detroit, with a majority African-American population which dominates the political institutions such as the mayor's office, the city council, the election commission, the charter commission, the school board, etc., organizers must continue to emphasize that the economy of the city is still controlled by the capitalist class, which is exclusively white and is based outside the city limits. Right. This phenomenon is somewhat similar to the conditions that prevail on the African continent and many other post-colonial societies where, despite the attainment of national independence, the economic sources of power still reside in the hands of the former colonial masters or the United States, which is the #1 imperialist power in the world. The complexity of this situation requires a global class analysis of the international division of labor as well as economic power. Consequently, no matter what the class composition or orientation of the political figures operating inside these post-colonial states, the role of the world capitalist system remains paramount. That's right. And Nkrumah called this political phenomena neocolonialism. In 1965, he published a book entitled Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, which analyzes the challenges facing Africa and other regions struggling to throw off the colonial yoke and build independent national states. According to Kwame Nkrumah, quote, the essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to its, in theory, independent, and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system, and thus its political policy, is directed from the outside, unquote. 3 years later, Nkrumah wrote another book entitled The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. The first section of this book is entitled Know the Enemy. And Nkrumah states on the first page that, quote, a number of external factors affect the African situation. And if our liberation struggle is to be placed in correct perspective, and we are to know the enemy, the impact of these factors must be fully grasped. First among them is imperialism, for it is mainly against exploitation and poverty that our peoples revolt. It is therefore of paramount importance to set out the strategy of imperialism in clear terms, unquote. And Nkrumah continues by pointing out that, quote, once the components of the enemy's strategy are determined, we will be in a position to outline the correct strategy for our own struggle in terms of our actual situation in accordance with our objectives. Both in the colonial territories and in the metropolitan states, the struggle was being waged against the same enemy. International finance capital under its external and internal forms of exploitation, imperialism, and capitalism, unquote. And Nkrumah wrote this in 1968, 42 years ago, and it's still true today. The capitalist class in Detroit is responsible for the current crisis involving joblessness, home foreclosures and evictions, utility shutoffs, the usurpation of political power from existing elected bodies, police repression, and the lack of health care and quality education. Therefore, the emphasis of our overall political strategy, the tactics that we utilize, the demands that we advance, and the slogans we chant must always point to the actual source of the problem.
Yes.
This is important because the ruling class will always attempt to blame the workers for their misfortune and poverty. In the current discussion around the economic crisis in Detroit, the corporate media never points to the role of the automotive companies and the failed policies related to capital flight, the undermining of organized labor, outsourcing, downsizing, and the lowering of wages. As a result of these distortions of the history and current situation inside the city, the workers and the oppressed are attacked viciously and made to feel that their plight is a result of their lack of correct values and their lack of hard work. In fact, Dave Bing takes his playbook right from the banks and the multinational corporations. Just read Detroit Cranes, the recently released Citizens Research Council report on Detroit. Yes. And the statements made by the Kresge Foundation, and anyone in their right mind can figure out that these policy initiatives are those of the capitalist class who in fact created the crisis themselves. Right. The Citizens Research Council of Michigan April 2010 report entitled The Fiscal Condition of the City of Detroit represents a blueprint for the ruling class on how to further the exploitation impoverishment, and disempowerment of the people in this area. People should read that report too. It's 79 pages. It's available online. This is not surprising when one reads who is on the board of directors and the trustees of the Citizens Research Council. These officers represent institutions such as Ernst & Young, LLP, Deloitte, the Detroit Economic Club, Wells Fargo Bank, DTE Energy, Comerica Bank, the General Motors Corporation, Kelly Services, those great employers, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, to name only a few. How can these capitalist interests craft policies for Detroit's future when they themselves are the real culprits behind the crisis that we are facing today?
Exactly.
How can they tell us what to do? Now, in the introduction to the Citizens Research Council report, it states clearly that, quote, the city government cannot afford to remain at its present size. Therefore, there are 4 ways the government can downsize. This is what the ruling class is saying in this Citizens Research report. 1, the elected mayor and city council could develop and implement required changes. They're already telling them what to do. The mayor and city council can implement changes specified in a consent agreement reached with a review team appointed by state officials under the Local Government Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is Public Act 72, that mandates the appointment of these emergency financial managers. And it does other things too, which they talk about. An emergency financial manager appointed under the Local Government Fiscal Responsibility Act can negate the authority of the mayor and the city council, can implement changes, and can renegotiate but not abrogate contracts. They're already telling them what to do. If an emergency financial manager recommends and the state approves, reorganization and restructuring can occur under protection of bankruptcy, which does allow contracts to be abrogated. No Michigan municipality has ever filed under federal bankruptcy laws, unquote. So they're already recommending that the city be put into receivership and bankruptcy in order to smash the unions and to abrogate all contracts. And also to abrogate the authority, limited authority that the local government officials have been enacted with. The report goes on to say that in order to address what could be an accumulated general deficit exceeding $400 million, this is what the Citizens Research Council is saying, Detroit city government must be restructured. They're telling them that they've got to restructure the government. The new structure must reflect both the reduced tax base and the limited ability of state government to provide shared revenues, unquote. Such a program of corporate dictatorship and dismantling must be rejected by the people of the city of Detroit. People must organize to oppose the implementation of these plans by the corporate community and their agents in local government. Now finally, I want to talk about what is to be done and the need for a program of action. In addressing these efforts on the part of the capitalist class and their agents, we must be organized around a political program that attacks the exploitative and racist system at its base. This is why we have, for the last 3 years, called for the immediate implementation of a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions in order to keep people in their homes in Detroit. If they had have listened to us 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we could have saved thousands of homes in this city.
That's right.
This shows how criminal it is in terms of what they're doing. And they can't say they didn't know. We wrote a letter to Governor Granholm over 3 years ago asking for the enactment of a state of economic emergency. It was ignored. The failure of the city administration, the state legislature, and the governor to impose a moratorium has resulted in the large-scale destruction of the housing stock in the city and throughout the region. With the school systems being heavily dependent on tax revenues for its operations, it is not surprising that there have been huge cuts in education, not only in Detroit, but throughout the state of Michigan. They're closing schools all over the state. They're using us because we're majority black. They can say, oh, well, look at them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have the right values. They don't know what to do. But it's happening in Livonia. It's happening in Dearborn. It's happening in West Bloomfield. It's happening in Troy, where they closed down the public library. So it's not just us here in the city of Detroit.